to corporate mobility managers, certainly one of the top 2 or 3 items that can impact mobility spend. So we appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us and trust that you will find this program extremely informative. So without further ado, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce your subject matter expert for today's session, Kyriako Bouris. We call him Rocco. He is the Vice President of Global Transportation Solutions here at Weichert Workforce Mobility. And in that critical capacity, he oversees every facet of Weichert's integrated move management solution. He strategizes with in-house household goods specialists, network partners to ensure superior point-to-point communication, cost control, and accountability throughout the entire household goods shipment process. Rocco has over 2 decades of relocation move management expertise, and before joining Weichert in 2004, he worked to hone his considerable talents at several third-party relocation companies and van lines. He has also earned the Certified Moving Consultant, or CMC, designation. Perhaps most importantly, Rocco and I are both originally from the Boston area here in Massachusetts in the United States. So after this webinar, we're happy to stay on the line and discuss the New England Patriots in any capacity, or more specifically, Tom Brady's quest for a 6th Super Bowl ring this winter. For those who might be interested in American football, we're here for you. And with that, I will turn things over to Rocco.
Tim, I thought the conference was actually about the Patriots, and sorry, I apologize. That's what I prepared for here, but we'll shuffle quickly. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Thanks, Tim, for the introduction there. I appreciate that. Given the time of the day, there's nothing really better for lunch or aids in the digestion process than talking household goods. So Tim has given me 30 minutes. I believe he's watching Judge Judy at 1:30, so I'm going to watch the clock. I'll be as precise as possible. Today's discussion, as Tim mentioned, is on household goods. And what I want to do in particular is talk to you a little bit about what's going on in the industry, what are some of the challenges, and more importantly, why it's important to you. Answer one of the most important questions I always get: how do I reduce my household goods spend? And then spend a few minutes on some of the trends that you may have seen or maybe asking yourselves. And as Tim mentioned, if you have questions, please send those in and we'll get to those as soon as we can. So starting off from an industry perspective, in particular in the U.S., the industry, as most of you know, has been deregulated in 2008. Why that's important is it's very difficult for us now in the States to compare pricing. For anyone working in Canada or other international offices, you're already familiar with this. There's no standardized pricing. Where the old days would ask, what's my discount, would dictate cost. Now what you're really looking for is, what's my tariff? This was done in order to provide the average consumer with an opportunity to secure better pricing, which is great if you're moving on your own. But in the national account arena, when you're looking to manage costs over a larger population of shipments, it's very difficult to do that and compare the pricing. We have an aging workforce problem. We have a serious problem with the household goods industry. Several years ago, the American Moving and Storage Association, or AMSA, released a stat that the average driver was 55 years old. They've not since updated that, I think because they scared the industry. So it's clearly a lot higher than 55 years old. But if you think about, aside from the physical labor that's involved in packing and loading, add to that driving, it's a tough career. It's very hard to recruit drivers into the profession. And it's also impacted capacity, meaning there's less drivers to handle the shipments to get everybody moved at the same time. From a regulatory perspective, you've heard us talking about the emission standards in California. The average cost for a tractor is $125,000. You're saying, I'm not in California, why do I care? It's because there's so many shipments that touch California one way or the other, and in order to get into the state, you have to be compliant. That added cost has to go somewhere, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Customs regulations are constantly changing. We have to be on top of those as an industry, make sure that we're importing or exporting according to customs regulations, and be ready to make those changes on the fly. Customs can and do today delay shipments significantly, so it's very important that we're aware of those, and there's an impact to you and to your assignees as we're moving those shipments. Within the U.S. in particular now, hours of service and ELDs, or electronic logging devices, these are going into place, or the ELDs are going into place by the end of 2017. Basically what it is, it's a tracking device that will be in every truck. Every driver will be logged how many hours they've actually been working. And once they time out, they have to literally pull over and rest for a given period of time. So this impacts the industry significantly based on the number of hours that they can actually work on a household goods shipment. I mentioned a little bit about pricing pressures. And in the household goods arena, one of the most common things is to try and negotiate price or cost down. And this has been happening forever in the industry. And this past year, with the failure of a rather large van line, it's really at the forefront of everyone's mind. And I think if you look at some of the stats that we have here, for example, the movers' costs in the last 5 years alone, they've gone up over 25%, in particular in the area of labor, equipment, and their materials. Packing materials, I believe in the last 12 months have been increased at least 3 times, with the 4th announced at the conclusion of the last round of hurricanes. So the costs associated with moving are constantly increasing. At the same time, the actual pricing itself that's paid to the movers has only gone up by 5%. And everyone's very familiar with the steep discounting and negotiations that are already in place. So the industry itself is struggling with a 20% margin there to make up. Add to this the shipment demographics. We're moving a lot more renters as opposed to homeowners, smaller shipments. These shipments take longer to travel. It takes longer to plan, more stops, and it's not as easy to get a driver from one location to another. Now they have to stop multiple locations to fill out their truck and get from point A to point B. That adds added layers of cost, and as I mentioned, the time and component that's associated with it. From a regulatory perspective, those ELDs that I mentioned, the electronic logging devices that will start tracking hours by the driver, it's estimated that it will cost about 2 weeks of driver time actually packing, loading, and hauling shipments in the coming years. So that's really 2 years that each one of the or 2 weeks, in a year that one of the drivers will lose, and that capacity that the van line or the agent will lose as well. And in this area, again, the question we're asking is how long can the industry keep this up?
You know, Rocco, I'm just going to jump in here for one quick second because someone asked a question. It's kind of an interesting question when you talk about how long the industry can keep this up. A couple of slides back, you mentioned the age of the current network of drivers and how they're getting older. And as bizarre as this question may sound, it's kind of interesting. How far are we away from robot trucks? I mean, you hear a lot about companies like Uber sending driverless cars out. Are driverless trucks something that could happen?
Yeah, we have that being worked on up at MIT right now. Tim, should be any day. No, actually, that's a great question. That's a great question, and I had a conversation with a client the other day, and they asked me that as well. We don't anticipate robot drivers. You never know that could happen. The focus really is on alternative transport methods. It's not the packing and the loading component of the move that's actually at the critical stage. It's actually how do we get that shipment over the road from point A to point B. And I'll talk a little bit about the container programs, but that's really the focus of the industry is how are we going to work on that. I have not heard any studies on robot drivers, but if I do, I will certainly let you know.
Yes, anything about robots and spaceships, please report back immediately.
You got it. Okay, and I mentioned before, probably the most common question I get is, how do I control my spend? How do I cut my costs? Obviously, with a relocation program, the transportation spend is top 3, certainly in some cases, first or second, as it relates to household goods spend. So you want to know, how do I control that spend? The easy answer, sacrifice quality. In the transportation industry, we used to always say, no noise is good news. Now, no noise is great news. Typically, if we're doing a good job, you don't know who we are, you don't know who our movers are, and everything is moving along well. When there's an issue, household goods obviously becomes a forefront or jumps to the forefront and can actually make or break a relocation because the last thing they remember is that truck or that container pulling away from their home. So there are cheaper solutions out there. You want to make sure that you're looking at it from a quality perspective. Know what you're paying. I know that sounds obvious, but as I mentioned before, the industry is deregulated. There are all sorts of different tariffs out there. From a domestic perspective, my recommendation is create your own tariff. Base it on weight, base it on distance. It's transparent. You know exactly what you're paying. And it's also an opportunity to do something that you probably can't do otherwise, and that's provide that price comparison. From an international perspective, volume, and I'll talk about volume in a second, is critical as well, because volume can be substantiated, but it can also lead to additional costs. So you want to make sure you know what you're paying up front and look at the two different components, typically a domestic shipment and an international shipment. And then I'll spend, in a minute, I'll go through a pricing checklist of some of those items that you want to make sure you're looking at and will help you compare from an apples to apples perspective what you're actually paying. The last thing anybody wants to do, and potentially the best savings, is to look at your policy. What are your policy benefits? What's there? What could be reduced? Or how can you tweak that to reduce your overall spend? All right, so first, from a pricing checklist, there's some key things you want to look at. One is, what's the shipment size, weight, or volume? What services are being performed? Is it full pack? Is it a full unpack? Oftentimes when we receive an RFP or when you're putting together an RFP, little things like that are not mentioned in the RFP or in the comparison, and it's very easy to reduce your cost on paper if you, for example, don't include a full unpack. I talked a little bit about quality, the quality of the provider. You want to look at those important metrics, which are important to your organization, typically customer satisfaction, on-time rating, are they going to be there when they say they're there, and then how do they perform from a claims perspective. Insurance, are you purchasing insurance? Are you getting valuation from the moving companies, and what's the difference? I'll talk about that in a little bit. How soon is your shipment going to get there? Can you save a few $1,000s on the front end by taking a slower transit? Absolutely. But then what are you paying in a per diem with that assignee or that transferee staying in a hotel? Hidden charges, as I mentioned, tariffs are no longer regulated. It's very easy to pop these charges into your program. And you also want to make sure that what you're being told you're going to be charged is in fact what you're being charged, and there aren't any last minute costs that pop up. Total program. If you're looking at your domestic and your international program individually, you may be overcharged in one area. It's my recommendation is take a look at what you're spending in both types of household goods shipments and compare that to look at total program costs. And then, given the state of the industry, probably more important than now is financial stability. Is that provider that you're looking at, are they going to be in business tomorrow?
Well, here's one question in your experience, and I know this is the kind of thing that you get asked a lot. Some of our clients come to you and they'll have you look at their household goods bill and just check it out, audit it, if you will, see where they might be overpaying. In your experience, when you look at those bills, what's the one area or the component that people are almost always overpaying for?
I think, Tim, there's probably two, and rather broad-based, but hidden charges is one area. Looking at what is that baseline tariff. And in particular, when you look at the U.S. market for a second, the expectation from a client will be that if I'm told I have a 60% discount, that's going to equate to a 60% discount off of previous regulated tariffs, and that's typically not the case. So I say hidden charges in the sense that the tariffs that are in place today vary significantly from van line to van line. The other one, and equally as important, I just touched on a little bit, is total program cost. So when we've done an analysis, it may be that you're paying or you're getting a very good deal on domestic shipments where it's easy to conduct that comparison. You can look on paper and say you're paying a great rate for domestic. But then if you look at the international household goods shipment and it's being managed by the same provider, your costs are inflated there to offset what's being paid on the domestic shipments. So it's very important to look at that area as well, look at the business collectively to say, I'm getting a fair price, I'm getting best value. One of the areas that a lot of times we fail to look at are policy benefits. And I know there's ramifications for doing that, but a few things you want to consider would be to reduce or eliminate storage benefits. As crazy as that sounds, there are companies out there today that do not offer storage at all. It's a culture within the organization, and they've done so successfully. Of course, the challenge becomes removing a policy or a benefit that's been in place for forever. Replacing weight with volume on international shipments. You see on the right-hand side a chart Tim actually drew that picture for me, so thank you, Tim. But what we wanted to show here is a comparison of some common lanes, traffic lanes, and the difference between basing your policy in weight and in volume. When you start adjusting volume and weight, the two components, you're basically paying for space. So if your policy, for example, states you can move 500 pounds by air, you could be paying, as you see on this little chart, you could be paying anywhere from $600 to almost $900 more per shipment, as opposed to defining a particular container size. It's in your interest to do so because you may have someone that has a very large sofa. It weighs 200 pounds. They want to move it. While that's not the intent of the program, they're within policy compliance, and then you start having those discussions. Why not just eliminate that up front and look at it from your total cost savings or potential is rather significantly. We've seen clients cap auto shipments based on distance. Years ago, it used to be 500 miles, move 2 cars. Today, we're seeing very common 1,000 miles as an entry point, or if you have 2 cars, you can move one at 500, the second moves after 1,000 miles. So considering limiting the number of autos or the distance that's required to ship those. Capping third-party services, things like appliances or crating, swing sets. A lot of the items that used to be considered part of a normal policy could be either removed or capped at a certain dollar amount. One of the common trends we've seen, I'll talk about it separately as well, is the self-moves, allowing individuals a certain amount, similar to a lump sum program, and allowing them to go out and source their own transportation program. And any of these, again, be prepared for pushback. It's very difficult to pull something away from someone, in particular in the international arena. If they're on assignment and all of a sudden you're capping or you're removing storage benefits, they're obviously you'll probably hear it from them. And then the other thing to consider is your policy competitive? What are those others in the marketplace? What are they offering? And is it possible that be a differentiator in securing somebody to come to your organization? A little bit about self-move options. Very popular these days. You could offer a program where your transferees could rent a truck, do their own packing, loading. There are container programs where they'll actually drop off a container to the residents. Some of them provide labor to do the packing and the loading. Either way, on paper, and in many cases, it's cheaper than your traditional move. It's very important, though, to consider the other components of that. One is liability. If something happens to a transferee while they're driving for a company relocation, who's liable? The associated claim costs for moving these items, assuming that you're not moving folks that are professional packers and loaders, it's going to be difficult for them to load those trailers or to load the containers, so they're probably going to have damages. Total cost of that program. Obviously, if you rent a truck, the transferee is going to be the one buying the cartons, doing the packing, doing the loading, so there's costs associated with that. And then probably more importantly is the productivity. Are they focused on actually driving cross-country and getting to destination, or are they focused on getting there and doing the job at hand?
So let me get this straight just so I understand. So inviting some guys over to have some beers and eat pizza and then move your piano could actually be a bad thing.
I didn't say that, Tim. I don't think it's a bad thing. Maybe for the piano, but not for the friends anyways.
Gotcha.
And then some of the trends that you're probably seeing, hearing about, briefly touching on some of these. Container solutions, I just mentioned them from a self-move perspective. Also, with regard to those robot drivers that Tim asked me about, is how are we going to get these items from point A to point B? That's the focus. And maybe looking at this almost like an international transport, where you have a crew packing, loading, they put it into a container or they put it into with a freight line, have them deliver it to destination, and then have a separate crew go out and deliver it. Very similar model as we do in international, similar model that we've done in Canada. But the industry as a whole, regardless, is losing drivers. We've got to find ways of getting things from point A to point B. There'll always be a need for the crews to pack, load, and deliver. It's just how do we get those things there? Many of you have asked about discard and donate programs, a great way from a corporate social responsibility perspective one word of caution is to validate the savings. A lot of these programs do come in and indicate that you're saving X dollars by eliminating certain pounds of household goods. Take a minute to look at those reports, make sure that what they're sharing with you are actual numbers, and validate the weight that's being claimed versus what your cost is. Aside from the corporate social responsibility benefit, of course, you just want to make sure you're not paying more and actually getting less. Along lines of the self-move or the lump sum phenomenon. So we see this a lot where transferees are given $5,000 and told to move cross-country. Tax implications aside, there's always a challenge of getting the right mover, getting the right container or truck rental, as I mentioned, and looking at the total cost and the time spent in these types of programs. Insurance and valuation, another trending topic. I have this discussion a lot with clients. Simply put, make sure you know what your coverage is. There are huge differences between the two. I don't have enough time today to go through those, but just know the type of coverage, who does the settlement, and what are the restrictions. There's also a cost component that you want to be aware of and know what exactly you're getting for what you're paying. And then one that's actually I've seen on the rise the last probably 6 months or so is volume-based pricing, and I'll go into a little more detail with that. Simply put, volume-based pricing, if you think back to when I was talking about international, you're paying for space. And I know there's a lot of information, or a lot of pictures on this slide here, but on the left-hand side is volume-based pricing. And if you think of taking a lamp and packing it in 3 different cartons with the base, the shade, and the light bulb, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it happens. You've just taken a 5-pound lamp, and in essence, you've made that a 63-pound shipment. Because the size of the boxes, as you see there, 3 cubic feet, get multiplied out from a factor, in this case, because let's assume it's a domestic move, 7 pounds, you're really moving 63 pounds. So you're obviously being overcharged in that area. Whereas a weight-based program, your shipment is actually weighed, and your supporting details or the weight tickets will support that you're being charged for 5 pounds and not the 63 that movers could do. This used to take place, it was commonplace many years ago. The progression of the tariffs did away with it, but I've seen it in the last couple of months as a way to combat the transparency discussion. But in reality, when you look at volume, you can take, and I know I'm exaggerating here a little bit with the lamp, but you can take a very small shipment, you can balloon pack it, meaning you use more cartons than you would need to, and then you can charge more for it. But equally as important is you have the supporting documentation that says, I did actually use 3 cartons, and here's proof of that. So you want to be careful of that. We've seen that come across in domestic shipments within North America, Canada and the US, typically based on weight. If you're in this type of model, or if you're considering it, just be cautious of the additional costs that can be associated with it. In conclusion, as I mentioned here throughout, you get what you pay for. And before I wrap this up, I do want to thank Tim for sharing this picture of his tattoo. I know it's very sensitive, and he thinks he got a good deal. But as you see the caption there, there'll always be someone who can do it better, or do it cheaper, I should say. And there's always someone that can do it better as well. Be careful. You do, especially in household goods, you do get what you pay for. There are cheaper solutions. Ask the right questions, look for transparent pricing, and focus on quality. And hopefully the end result is to get best value for those shipments.
I am not particularly proud of that tattoo, but I did learn a valuable lesson that day. And it is, Rocco, as you point out, that you get what you pay for. And sometimes the cheapest option, while appealing on paper, is not always the case. And I'll be wearing it with not so much pride for the rest of my days. But again, I think the lesson made it all worthwhile. We're kind of up against it, and we did promise 30 minutes of content here. But before we do go, we do want to take a couple of questions. There have been some questions coming in, but I'm going to skip the questions just over that for 1 second, just to get some important information for those folks who might have to drop off. Contact info. If you do want to reach out to Rocco for any suggestions, comments, questions, more detail on some of the topics he's raised, some horse betting tips, reach out to him at kbouris@weichertwm.com. And for those of you who are looking to get CRP credit from Worldwide ERC, as I mentioned, we will send a list of everyone who attended 2 ERCs so they can see the folks who showed up. But when you are responsible for logging in and catching your own, registering your own credit, and the seminar ID number is 15200. As mentioned, we will go back and take and look at some of the questions that have come in, and for those questions that we can't get to, Rocco has promised to look at all of them, and we'll get responses on our blog. It's weichertworkforcemobility.com/blog, and within the next 48 hours, we'll go through all of the questions that came in and address those. We will step back now and just weed through a few of the questions, get as many as we can in the next couple of minutes. Rocco, one question that came in when you were talking about self-moves, someone wrote in and just said, if you were going to go the self-move route, what is the most important tip to keep in mind?
It's a tough question, actually. If you're looking at it from a policy component, I think you want to define, what's within that self-move. Are you saying to your transferees you're only going to get a truck rental or container program, or are you saying that you're going to be able to provide them with the labor and the materials associated with that? Because once you do that, then you're basically paying, in most cases, even more than a mover. I would clarify that up front. If the intent is to offer a self-move program, then state that specifically, that the transferee is required to do all of their packing, their loading, all of the associated costs, such as the material. That's the intent of the program.
Someone else asked someone else mentions that they're familiar with self-move options in the U.S., but are they common outside the U.S.? In Europe and Asia, is self-move an option?
There are companies that promote or are available for self-moves. Where it gets a little tricky is a lot of these companies also promote themselves as being able to service international shipments. And I would just caution you, as I mentioned, customs regulations that are associated with that, with crossing borders. It's easier to handle a self-move within one country. Once you start crossing borders, it does get a little tricky. So I'd ask the questions and ensure that you don't have any customs-related violations associated with that. But they do exist.
Okay. We always tread lightly when it comes to questions pertaining to tax, and there are no tax experts here on the line today. We will be expressly clear about that. But someone did ask about any tax implication concerns on lump sum and self-move shipments. And again, not as tax. That might be something we'd have to forward to a tax professional within our organization and get back to them on.
Yeah, Tim, I actually struggled with how to spell tax, so I'd be wary to answer that from a lump sum perspective. We can certainly find out and verify. The one thing that's come up is looking at how household goods as a whole are going to be considered going forward, if it's going to be if they're going to be taxed going forward. So I'm actually waiting to hear on that as well from a tax perspective.
And as mentioned, all of these questions we will have responses to on our website, especially the ones we can't get to. We will get one more in right now, and this is kind of I like this question because it's kind of it's a question that you could probably spend all day answering, but maybe you can whittle it down. It's what is the golden rule when choosing the right household goods provider for you? Is there a golden rule?
It's your own. That's what I would say. It's your own. What are you looking for? If you're looking for simply cost, are you looking for quality? Or if you're looking at, in most cases, if you ask me what my golden rule would be, it would be best value. You want to make sure you're paying a fair price, but you're getting quality service. And we've jumped around that a lot today in the webinar, that you can get cheaper solutions. It's a tough question to ask. It all depends on the individual and the client. And at the end of the day, what are they looking for? What are you looking for? Because you can't get all three.
Excellent. Well, again, as promised, we packed a lot into that. All thriller, no filler. Rocco, I want to thank you for sharing your insight with us today. I want to thank our audience for your participation. We will have a recording of this webinar available on our YouTube channel later today. If you registered and attended this website, you'll be receiving a link. Also, if you have need for these slides themselves, you can reach out to Rocco, or you can email solutions@weichertwm.com, and we're happy to get those out to you. We do hope you'll join us for future webinars, including a guide to mobility best practices in the Asia Pacific region, which we will be presenting in December. On behalf of myself and Rocco and Weichert Workforce Mobility, thank you for attending, and enjoy the remainder of your day.